colleagues and I will introduce ourselves in a bit. Thank you for your attention throughout the day. We do not have slides because we've nominated ourselves the summarizer of the event. So we want to keep it very brief and we want to keep it conversational. So we do hope that you're not all talked out from the workshops because we do want to have conversations to end off before we go enjoy the wine and the cheese, and I hope there's alternative travel arrangements for people who are driving. Well, that's on another note. I am Dr. Shawnee Hardware. I'm very new to the School of Early Childhood Education at George Brown. I am lucky to have my colleagues with me, Bernice and Gail, but other colleagues won't start naming names and then I get side eyes at the department meeting. And then we have Dr. Carl James, so I'll ask them to introduce themselves.
Oh, hi, good afternoon. So yes, I'm Bernice McLeod. I'm a professor in the School of Early Childhood. I'm not new. And not new to the sector. So yeah, really just thrilled to be here talking more about what works, what irks, what the opportunities are, what we've learned today.
I'm Gail Hunter, and I'm a prof at George Brown and coordinator of a couple of programs. I'm very excited to be here, and talking about CWELC and anti-racism is something that's much of an interest for me.
I'm Carl James. I teach in Faculty of Education and Sociology at York University. Thanks for this.
Okay, so let's start with a summary. We have heard very interesting discussion around what are some of the challenges as well as possibilities. And we were reminded that we are to end the discussion on a positive, optimistic note. So while we summarize, we will then go into our recommendations, right? And I'll ask Bernice and Gail and Carl to make their observations or their summaries, and then we'll take those up into recommendations.
I'll use this one. I guess, as Gail said, I've been doing some work around anti-racism and inclusion for a number of years. And what struck me today in terms of the conversation is I'm hearing some themes. So just, in terms of my own notes, the need for more advocacy and a collective voice. And really taking away this notion of enforceable conditions that are embedded in the agreements and the opportunity when provinces and territories are looking at following up and establishing new agreements, building on those, that they're thinking about that. And the need for safe public funding, to safeguard public funding rather, and to ensure that the community is involved in these conversations. And for me, when I think about the community, I'm thinking about racialized communities. I was Oxfam in Ottawa last weekend, which was organized by the coalition, Oxfam, CRU, and talking about who's missing from the table. It's not having these conversations. The families are not part of the conversation, and we've heard that throughout the day as well. So I'm thinking about how we define affordability, accessibility, inclusivity, quality, and implementation, which keeps coming up again as a theme, and the need for transparency, accountability. Think about, again, how do we define quality? And for me, it's thinking about anti-racism, anti-oppression, and anti-bias frameworks. And all of that for me then safeguards the social emotional well-being of the workforce, the children, and the families. And I'll talk a little bit more about a decent work project that I've been involved in with the ACO and how we are trying to ensure that families have, and each early child educators have a voice, but also about a wage project that I've been involved in when we move to more hopeful opportunities.
Thank you, Bernice. I'm so thankful I followed her because she said everything I wanted to say. The one thing I would like to just tack on to that, it is really important that we do reflect on who we are and we stop and we listen to what others are saying. it's so true, and I can't remember who said it earlier, the voices we often hear are those of the white folk, not those folk that really do need support. So our Indigenous, our brown people, our Black people, we're not hearing from them. And it's really important that we honestly stop and be critical thinkers. We need to be accountable, we need to be transparent. And thinking about that, it's really important that we become allies. And when people say they're allies, but we're performative allies. And it's really important that we do things intentionally, and we stand up, and we speak with. We don't speak for, we speak with. That's all I wanted to say, because I agree with everything my colleagues said.
Oh yes, good. Thanks very much. One of the things that we talked about in the group that I led just now is we need to pay attention to the cultural context in which we are operating. And I think today we heard much about the cultural context, and some of them were there's less access to schooling and education as time goes on. We hear about kids with special needs need to be really paid attention to and be taken care of. The labor shortage in child care, and we heard about how in other communities, as in Nova Scotia, we have free primary education and things like that. We also heard about how the extent to which the $10 a day child care, and I like the word retail politics, connected to that. I like how that was referred to. We also heard about the cultural context in which we are operating, that we need to pay attention to what's happening in the neighborhoods, and how sometimes it's important to center community and communities. And when we talk of centering community, the geographic community is one, but also the ethnic, racial, social, economic, all those other kinds of communities, marginalized communities, the racialized communities, and that these people bring to us as we work with them. We also heard about the theoretical framework that's used, and I think Jessie and the guys have talked about the critical race theoretical framework that's being used and employed. So I wonder how can we bring a framework and make explicit the theoretical framework that we're using as we articulate our ideas, as we engage people with these ideas. But you just don't use critical race theory perspective because you're dealing with Black people. You have to use it generally if it's going to be a theory, and it is a theory that you use it to work. And you don't just only ask ethnic background or racial background because you're dealing with Black people or Indigenous people. Everybody has ethnic and racial background, and you should always know. So if you're given data, you would want to know how does that data reflect for different racialized groups if we're moving towards equity. So those are some of the things that I heard and I see that provide us the cultural context that we're paying attention to. And of course, I cannot leave out the fact of low pay, the need for early childhood education workers, and all those things that really right now we need to pay attention to as we're working towards making better lives for our young people. So we work with you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And so we want to start our discussion, well, not start, but continue our discussion around ideas for success, what that can look like, by looking at centering children or the child. And I know that to some extent How Does Learning Happen does this, but what we recognize is that there's still this whole, even though families are mentioned, these are mentioned sometimes in very limited ways. And so in addition to that, we want to ask and discuss what does that look like when we talk about families in relation to kinship and in the Supporting Vulnerable Family, that is a city-funded research that I'm currently doing. We see that there's so much, there's an expansion, particularly of young people, as they think about families beyond biological. So what does that mean for our programs once we think about that? But also, we want to interrogate the notion of play and the innocence of play, as our play has always been neutral, right? And what is the role of educators as we think about play? Are we always on the periphery? And what does that mean for policy and the training, as well as the innocence of the child? Because we know that, especially coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, that notion of innocence has been really been turned over on its head, of children being always innocent and existing in a bubble has been so much permeated within the field and also in our policy documents. So again, I will pass the mic along. I know Carl, your mic is functioning, so Bernice,
Yeah, so I guess some of the other thought in picking up on that is whether, what is our image of the child? And we think about, again, an opportunity as we're building this, what we hope will be universal, and there's some tension there with the $10 a day, and we heard quite well represented today this whole discussion about who really has access based on this $10 a day. But for me, I was saying to my panelists here earlier that one of the things that really struck me and kind of the overarching theme for me is how we view children and families in terms of from a societal perspective, and why there's this discussion about how do we support children with special needs? What do we do with children with special needs? What do we do with those people and those differences? And for me, it's kind of steeped in this colonial kind of framework around how we understand human differences and the value of the care community and caring as a profession. And so we often, are not sure what to do about the youngest children and seeing them as not really as valued. And I say they, the world kind of they and the world kind of we, in terms of, this colonial perspective that they don't contribute to society. They aren't working, so they're not economically producing, right? And so we think about children not really, being educated until they're 6. And then we worry about or think about human diversity, or we don't recognize that. So children with disabilities are seen as problematic and difficult, and how do we what do we do with them? How do we fix them so that they can participate? And the same is true, we look at seniors, right? The elderly, the other end of the continuum, and we devalue care work and elderly who are not able to contribute anymore. So for me, it's also about shifting the dialogue, shifting attitudes. Carl, you were talking about the cultural context. So it's the political context, it's the social political context as we think about children and families, and then thus, the frameworks, the agreements, and how we truly then support this work and support the workforce and think about what's important to them and how this work is important to us as a society.
There's a couple of things in what you were speaking about that I'd like to just build on. One is the fair wage, and it is important when we want to make change or change policy or get policy put into action. It is really important that we do stand up and we listen to our families and we speak on behalf of our families with our families. You are part of making the change. You can't sit back and let others make the change. You need to stand up and make the change. Looking at play-based curriculum and looking at learning environments for young children, many times we don't really look at the children. We create this blanket program, a program that we expect to meet the needs of all children. It doesn't meet the needs of all children. For children that are coming from different cultures, the family setup is different than other children. Everyone is very unique, and the child's behavior, because they're not doing what is typically done in a kindergarten. If we go back to Freuble, what's typically done, and they can't sit still, and they're a little bit fidgety, and they're walking around, or they're talking or singing to themselves, suddenly they're labeled behavioral problems. And we really need to watch that, because setting them up for failure. And so it is important to speak to families, even before we report them for neglect or not looking after their children. It's really important. The majority of children in spaces taken up in children's days is of Indigenous and Black children. And I'm just going to leave you with that to think about.
So the idea then is we have to move towards shifting what's happening right now. One of the things I keep coming back to, and of course this is a bigger discussion that we can debate for a while, is how do we understand children? You know, the child, do we think they're worthy for this education we give when they go to kindergarten? Or do we think it starts earlier? At what age do we think it starts? Or is it just, as I was saying earlier, is it just only responsibility of the parents to bring the child up to time into the child enters in kindergarten? Or is this a societal responsibility? Those are some of the critical thinking we have to engage in right now. And we're not. And here's where governments have to start thinking, because of course government can say, yes, we're doing our role. After all, we have kindergarten, we have schools, kids are going to school, and it's free education, etc., etc. But what about before they enter kindergarten? Don't we as government have to do something? Or we're saying they do not have the same kinds of education. They don't need the same kind of education. The people who work with them don't need the same kind of education as the person who's teaching secondary school. Because they don't need to know, these are just kids. They just come into the room and they sleep all day. So therefore, why do you need? But, you know, we need to do that work, and we're not doing that work. And so for me then, it's that bigger discussion about how we are shifting and the need for that shift. And of course, we all have to start thinking education start much more early than we're given it credit to. And people with the necessary education need to be compensated as you would compensate anyone else. You know, because we live in this kind of society where that compensation reflects the value we give to the kinds of work and education a person is given. So all these become, for me, the work that needs to be done, and how we might start to see play. And you were talking about play just now. Is play an education thing, or is play just simply, kids just simply have something that they're playing with all the time? Or is there an education about how we lead kids into play, because what play can produce in terms of the child's intellectual development, the social development, and more important, and very important, picking up on your point, is how we help these children to work with each other across race, across differences, and when we bring them to the child care place, how those require that kind of education that we bring as a child education. All that needs to be part of that discussion that we're going to have to engage society on, and not just simply say, well, they just simply playing with kids, and that's good enough. We need to do more work. And when I say we, I don't mean everyone sitting here in the early childhood education people. I think everybody, the society, because everybody is implicated in this process.
Gail is reminding us we need to move to solutions. So I'll make mine very brief because I'm hoping there'll be space for questions and conversation. For me, we have to move beyond equity and look at anti-racism. I think operating in a multicultural society, from my experience being a newcomer in Canada, and from my own students' research, which I supervise, there's still so many educators, and I think this is implicit in the policies, they're so uncomfortable with speaking about race beyond inclusion. And so ensuring that there's explicit anti-racism languaging, moving how does learning happen, and other pedagogical framework to speak more specifically around anti-racism and what that means. Another student of mine who was unable to come here did research on inclusion and the notion of intentional inclusion and intentional inclusion workshop. So just beyond having buzzwords, but also being intentional in our approaches and our policy, explicitly naming race, explicitly naming systemic issues. And I know some of you might be thinking this is already happening, but when we really look at the policy documents and where the money is going, I've heard of educators not being able to have these open discussions, and where are they coming from? And the other thing, my recommendations would be is thinking about other structures. So I had the pleasure of working with colleagues on a research project, exploratory project, looking at services for undocumented families, particularly Black mothers, and the barriers that exist in policies for undocumented families, right? And then when we talk about intersectionalities and how we become gatekeepers or maybe service blockers through languaging of policies and through languaging and the enactment of policies in many of our laws that govern our centers, etc., then we have to think about how do we make services equitable but also liberatory for the people that use our services, right? So even expanding the notion of who has access, right? I think for the most part we've been talking about newcomers, people with different, I guess, legal status in Canada, but what about people in precarious legal status, and how do they get access? How do they get access to this Canada-wide initiative? Do they get access? Are some of the questions. If we really want to build on equity, are the questions that we need to start asking ourselves. Are the surveys going to them? Or are we having surveys with only people with legal status? And then we can talk about equity and anti-racism.
Thank you. So I don't pretend to have all the answers and have all the expertise. There's a lot of wisdom in this room, and we heard a lot throughout the day. So for me, I think about coming at this from various perspectives or opportunities to really shape the narrative and be hopeful about universal early learning care that really supports all children and families, and I think it starts at pre-service. I'm really proud and excited to say at George Brown that we've been engaged in really training and supporting our early child educators around anti-racism, anti-bias. We have a number of workshops which are now morphing into a course. We've been collaborating with our community partners to do this work. We've been, again, working with various coalitions and activists like Atkinson Center's been partnered with the ACO, again, the coalition, a number of different organizations who are involved in the good fight, right? And so I'm feeling like there's hope because there's more opportunities as well for people to come together and talk and share and learn and build. And that means also including, as we've said and you've heard throughout the day, the children and the families who are most impacted. I'm also, nod to City of Toronto, who have been really looking at this work and playing a leadership role, and hearing about other opportunities and other work across Canada and across the province. I'm thinking of the Wage Project that I've been involved in as well, where we're working with racialized Black moms who are affected, educators, practitioners, and again, any of these opportunities to bring people together and talk about it so we can influence policy, so it's not the government telling us what's best for us, right? So that's kind of my thoughts on this.
We've been doing quite a bit at George Brown, and there's a lot happening at the City of Toronto as well, and plans that we will be doing the anti-racism training, but I believe we may be at George Brown be doing a certificate program coming soon, we hope. Yes, give it a post-diploma certificate program in anti-racism. So hoping coming to you soon. I know my director's glaring at me right now and saying, yeah, we need to talk, but that's okay. We also have, we're in the midst of developing an anti-racism in early childhood program, the three of us. We've been working on it, and all of our students will be getting it, so that's a step in the right direction as well. But you as educators, there's excellent programs out of Alberta University, Indigenous Studies, and you're eligible to take those. Sign up for them. Take them. Take the pledge that you're going to do something regarding the truth and reconciliation. Sign up and take that pledge. These are things that we can do to be proactive and really become allies. And I mean everyone. Allyship doesn't only belong to white folk. It belongs to all of us. And so we need to stand up and be allies. I think that also across Canada, it's been really amazing. I've had the opportunity to work in Nova Scotia for a few years now, quite a few years. Went and talked to them about rolling out the pre-kindergarten program because everybody was quite anxious, and that was really quite enlightening. But out of it came the opportunity to go and do some work on anti-racism. And they also have some excellent courses online on, I'm just doing a shout out for the East Coast, my hometown. A little shout out in that they do have, we've developed some courses on just EDIAA in the community, in planning your curriculum and curriculum development, sort of looking at yourself, a lot of self-reflection as well as pedagogical leadership, EDIAA pedagogical leadership. These courses are offered online, so you can be able to take them in their async. So just doing a shout out for a couple of programs so that you can start doing your own goals and moving forward. Those of you that are members of the College of BCE, this is something that would look really impressive, right?
Thanks very much. I'm encouraged when I hear courses and going beyond the simple workshops to think about courses, because I always think that when we do workshops, workshops tend to be sometimes a one-day thing, a one-shot day in a 2 hour. And I always think about, after I leave the workshop, I have questions. And the persons and my colleagues are not there to answer those questions. And so it's always good when we go beyond the workshops, because I always wonder how effective those workshops are. And therefore, what you're saying, I think, is encouraging, and it takes us further than just this one-shot thing. It leaves something to be accomplished, I think, much, much more. I also think we need to, as we look in these work that we're doing, and we're focusing on Indigenous, Black, and newcomers, at the same time, you have to also do the same kind of education in people who are not Black, Indigenous, and newcomers, because these Black, Indigenous, and newcomers are interacting in society with everyone else. So if one group of people are getting the education, how come the others are not getting the education in order to make sure that when they meet each other up at the parties or the golf course or somewhere, that they have some kind of conversation with each other. So so we have to think of education beyond just simply they cannot be parallel and only. Yes, we might have to have this conversation in homogeneous groups. That might be useful, but despite the homogeneity of the group, because we're going to use the culture of the group to ask certain kind of question and move people along, that's necessary to be able to do so. I like the idea of undocumented families, and I raise that because I wonder about how Canadians think of the ethics related to those things, especially knowing whatever happens to them affects us all. But it's not something that we consider. But it's an important thing for us to consider. And I think what today reminds me of is we need to throw everything into our conversation if we're going to move along. And then one last point I wanted to bring up is the whole idea of decolonization. As we talk of EDI, there is this need to start an equity We need to think about decolonization and whatever decolonization means. Let's say, using theories related to decolonization in order to move along. I put that out fast. Make serious consideration.